Hello, friends and neighbors. This is Jeff coming to you with our Screwtape review. This past Sunday, we did chapter 1, and so that's what we're going to go over right now. Chapter 1, if you were to give it a theme, you would call it the chapter about jargon and real life. And so, this is how Screwtape begins his teachings with young Wormwood. It's a fascinating view into human nature. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm always been attracted to the Screwtape Letters to begin with. Is because it really does a good job of hammering out the ways in which we think and the battles with which we wage upon ourselves. It's the spiritual warfare. It's the battle of the mind, and it's a battle of the soul. It's a battle of the heart. And in order to combat Satan and the ways of temptation, we have to keep in line with what's going on the inside of us, and how our own weaknesses leading us astray, or how the way we think and the way we react, how it can all lead us astray. And chapter 1 hits this at the very beginning when he starts talking about argument. Wormwood would tell, Screwtape will tell Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. He'll then go on to say, they still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. He talks about the use of argument at the get-go. And argument is one of those things that's happening a lot today in today's world. Arguing with other people, it's always been around, but and this might be a personal feeling of mine, with the advent of social media, the practice of arguing just seems to have exploded in the amount of times that somebody argues, the fact that nobody really minds to argue, and they actually look forward to arguing, and things like this. And again, these mentalities have always been with us. It's just that over the last few decades it's become more because of social media. But what's interesting about how Screwtape wants Wormwood to either use or not use argument is to just look at the way that it's used. The quote is, it sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. Now again, just arguing with somebody, the act of arguing runs on speed of thought. We're not listening to someone that we're in a heated argument with. We're too busy thinking about what our response is going to be. Now, I'm not talking about, and hopefully we're mature enough to realize there's a difference between discussion and argument. We're talking about argument. We're talking about the argument which doesn't do much for anybody. And again, it runs off speed. It runs off not listening to the other person, but only listening to your own thoughts so that you can come up with the next zinger. I mean, goodness sakes, you can read in the book of Proverbs numerous proverbs that have to do with arguing or dealing with people. And it'll say things like, for a want of wood, the fire goes out, and with a want of words, the quarrel ceased, and things along these natures. Argument runs off words, speed, thought, quickness of thought without listening. And the devil wants us to stay there. But what the devil doesn't want us to do is actually to argue from the stance of discussion, what we might call positive argument. Because once you start going into the realm of positive argument or a discussion, now we're starting to talk about things about right and wrong. Do we know that there's such categories as right and wrong? Right, there is right and wrong behavior. There are right and wrong morals. There are right and wrong activities with which we can put ourselves in. But look at the world around us. And again, this is what this book is going to have us do time and time again. Look at the world around us. How often do we hear the words right and wrong these days? We don't as much. because the devil has infiltrated our society and has turned our right and wrong into my truth. That's a big one that we hear these days. You have your truth, I have my truth. Da, 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 da. But the problem with that is that we use it my truth. It is my truth. Truth is something that is a fact. It is true. If I drop my coffee cup, it's going to hit the floor because gravity's there. That's true. It can be proven. It's copied. It's going on. When we start talking about your truth, my truth, we have watered down the definition of truth, and now truth means opinion. And this is where Screwtape wants us to be. He wants us to use opinion masquerading as fact. And he's going to repeat this to Wormwood in this letter. Don't start talking to the patients about argument, because if you argue over something, especially something real, you're going to awaken his mind to things that he cannot see. And Screwtape nor the devil wants us to think about things we cannot see as real. Why? We can't see God, can we? And for a lot of people on this planet, the sheer fact that you can't see God is enough to keep them away from God. But if we can have our mind put into a place where we do start thinking about things that we cannot see, then our mind might go to the direction of God. Screwtape doesn't want that. But we have to be careful with argumentation. We have to be careful, in our own private lives, because the Bible will talk about the need to stay away from the argumentative person. Because the wrong side of argumentation, the evil side, the negative form of argumentation, which nobody wins, arguing for the sake of arguing, for example. This is spoken about in the Bible in a negative way. And we're going to talk about a couple of those instances now. If you get a chance, flip to 2 Timothy chapter 2, and you look at verses 14 to the beginning of verse 17. And it says this. It says, Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he is strongly oppressed. He strongly opposed our message. At my first defense no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. That was actually 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. But there we have a situation of maturity. We have Alexander the coppersmith, who did great harm to Paul. And Paul, even though Paul will warn Timothy, you stay away from him. You do not get mixed up in him or what he's doing. But you know what? No one came to my defense. No one stood with me. That's all right. May it not be charged against them. There's a great example of maturity, spiritual maturity. Don't get roped in by harm that is done to us. Because that's the thing. It's a very dangerous path, the path of justifiable sin. And if someone does me harm, and I respond in a sinful way, who wins? Again, what we're being challenged with in the Screwtape Letters is the topic of everything that we do in life, everything we have, it's either going to bring us closer to God or take us farther away. But we have the choice. If someone does me wrong, I do not have to respond to them in a sinful way. I do not even have to carry it with me. I can let it go and just give it to God and say, God, you handle it, and then I go on with my life. But what we want to avoid is 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, which says this, Remind them of these things and charge them before God not to quarrel about words, which does no good, but only ruins the hearers. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. But avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk will spread like gangrene. So here Paul told Timothy, it's like you remind the people of the good things that of Christ that he just talked about earlier in chapter 2, and he also charges them before God not to quarrel over words. Don't quarrel over words. Later he'll say, avoid irreverent babble. That's the funny thing about the temptation to argue. We think that the thing in which we're arguing about is so important. Is it? Is every argument that we have important, earth-shattering, groundbreaking? Let's be honest. No, it is not. And so when we get wrapped up into this point, great damage can be done. Churches have split, people have left Christ, all because of some foolish argument. It profits no one. It does no good and only ruins the hearers. However, we've been called to present ourselves before God as one approved, who does not need to be ashamed, and who knows how to rightly handle the word of truth. This is what we've been called to, because if we go after irreverent babble and argumentation, arguing about words and all this stupid stuff, it will lead people astray, and it can cause more danger than gangrene. And it's going to spread like gangrene. In our country, we don't worry about gangrene a whole lot in our modern age of medical advancement. But back in the day, if someone got gangrene and they didn't catch it quick, they're going to lose an arm, they're going to lose a leg. It's because gangrene is the poison that gets into the blood through a cut, or the skin breaking. You're getting some sort of injury that you're not able to purify. The poisons can get in there, and it's going to cause you to either lose a limb or lose a life. Such is the danger of hanging around the argumentative person. In Titus chapter 3, in verse 9 through 11, it says this. It says, "But avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. As for a person who stirs up division after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him. Knowing that such a person is warped and sinful, he is self-condemned." So here we go again, Paul talking to Titus about the argumentative person. Again, what we're talking about is the person who arguments from the negative point of view. Someone who just likes to argue for the sake of argument. Paul told Titus, avoid foolish controversies, avoid genealogies, avoid dissensions, and avoid quarrels about the law. It's like, well, why? What, are you trying to dodge the topic, trying to dodge the issue? No. The point is that they're unprofitable and worthless. That's what I'm saying. It's like we're not talking about actual questions that somebody may have. We're talking about these little tidbits and things people just want to argue about for the sake of arguing, for no other reason than arguing. And it's a waste of time. It wears everybody out. And again, we already said waste of time, but that's what it is. It's a time stealer. I only have so much time in the day to deal with various people's issues. I don't have time to chase down everybody's pointless argument. But also for the person who insists on doing this kind of behavior, Paul told Titus, warn him. You're being an argumentative person. You're causing harm to the church. You don't get to do that. They persist, you warn them a second time. They continue to persist, you have nothing more to do with them. We do not have to attend every argument that we're invited to. Have nothing more to do with them. Why? Because by this point, if you've had to warn them 3 times, by that point that person is warped and sinful and self-condemned. In other words, he's not interested in listening to anybody. He's only interested in what he thinks he already knows. Guess what? Tons of people who argue in the world today, they don't want to learn. They just want to have their beliefs justified. They want to be justified in their own beliefs or in their own actions. Or they just want to try to see if they're smarter than you. That's all they want. They're not looking for information. They're not looking for truth. They're just looking to have their own way with you. Guess what? They don't get to do that to you, nor do they get to do that to the church. So if you've warned them 3 times, have nothing more to do with them. Don't even just refuse to argue with them. So that's how come, the fact of arguing, on the surface it can be used as, okay, if we can just get the Christians to argue with one another, that's going to be awesome. But the thing about it is like it might not. Arguing, it could. If the people get into it and the battle gets heated, it can lead people astray. That's fine. But also, again, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the danger of this is if you're arguing with somebody, especially when you're arguing over things like, God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, the nature of creation, and all these things that we read about in the Bible, the devil doesn't necessarily want us to do that too long. He wants us to do it if it can lead us astray, but he doesn't want us to do it too long, according to Screwtape, because then we start thinking about things we cannot see. Now we start thinking about proofs. Now we start thinking about, can I take stock in a God that I cannot see? And if I can, then I might step away from the devil. Because that's the thing, it's an interesting power of proof. And the thing is that proof means nothing without the heart. Again, our argument, hopefully, a good-natured argument or a discussion will lead to a conclusion. Okay, well, how do we get to the conclusion? People offer their various proofs. Well, just because someone offers proof, that doesn't mean people will believe the proof. Proof means nothing without the heart. I'll give you an example. In the study of the Bible, there is a branch of study that's called apologetics, right? And apologetics is just a fancy word that means, biblical truths, or, biblical evidences, that you can actually prove Christ. And this goes back to the book of Acts, for example, which we're told that Paul the apostle would reason Christ. In other words, Paul didn't just preach. He was able to reason with his audience why Jesus was the Christ. Well, goodness sakes, if all we have is evidence, or if all we need is evidence in order to point people to Jesus Christ, then all we need to do is send people on a Google search, right? In order for them to find the evidence, they have the evidence leads them to Christ, they become believers, they become baptized, and then here we go. That's it. Boom, we're done. Well, unfortunately, that's not as easy as it sounds, because proof means nothing without the heart. We can be swimming in fact, but if we do not take in the fact, it doesn't mean much. Going back to apologetics, people don't like the Bible, or some people don't like the Bible, or some people do not believe in the Bible because they say things like it was written by man, or it's a man-made book. There's not really much evidence to say what it really says, and da 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 da. The fact of the matter is that the Bible, people like to say the New Testament, but the truth is the entire Bible. The Bible has more historical evidence pointing to its accuracy than any other historical book ever discovered by far. In other words, it's not even close. I'll give you an example. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to give you some time to think about it. Who wrote and spoke the Gettysburg Address? I'm giving you a little time to Google that in case you have forgotten. Okay, it was Abraham Lincoln. Now here's the question. How do we know? How do we know it was Abraham Lincoln who wrote and then spoke the Gettysburg Address? Well, we have copies of the speech. Historians have found something along the lines of, there have been as many as 6 copies of the Gettysburg Address that had existed, that were written by Abraham Lincoln. Right? He wrote the original, and he spoke the original, obviously. But then also, again, we're in the midst of the Civil War. He wrote some others which were then auctioned off for the benefit of raising funds for the war. So anyway, we have 6, maybe 8 copies of the Gettysburg Address written by Abraham Lincoln, thus proving Abraham Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address. Okay. Well, what about the Bible? What about the New Testament? Okay. Remember that. 6 to 8 copies of the Gettysburg Address written by Lincoln. Okay. Historians, archaeologists have found over 5,800 Greek fragments of the New Testament, which all build upon each other. In other words, they support each other. Which means, like, if someone was able to develop a bomb which blew up nothing except Bibles, we would be able to reproduce the Bible with no problem at all. And this doesn't even count the over 10,000 fragments that have been found in Latin, and a further 10,000 fragments or more found in various other languages. The Bible is without precedent and the sheer volume of historical evidence. To which the books of the New Testament, again going back to the New Testament, were starting to be written within, say, a decade or so after the ascension of Jesus. Now you can compare that, to example, to the biographies about Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. The earliest copies of those were written something like 500 years after he lived. With the Bible, we're talking about decades. In other words, there were people around who were alive who witnessed the things which the Bible wrote about, which all they had to do to shut it down was to say, you know what? That's not right. That's not accurate. In which the Bible talks about, Paul would write this in 1 Corinthians, talking about the people who saw Jesus after he was raised from the dead in 1 Corinthians 15. He said, look, there are some people who are still alive who saw this. Go ask them. In other words, the evidence exists. The evidence actually isn't really that hard to find either. Again, Google searches, books, you can listen to people talk about these things. It's out there, it's readily available. So it's like, goodness sakes, well, why don't the church just share this with people? Well, we do. But the problem is, not everybody's willing to hear the message. Not everybody's willing to hear the evidences of it. Because it all goes back to a matter of heart. You need more than evidence. You need the heart that will hear. You go to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, for example. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. It says this. It says, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Okay, so talking about this, he's going into this topic about food offered to idols, and he's going to be talking about some other things. But before he gets into all that, Paul takes time to discuss this. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. In other words, we can get so cocky in our knowledge. We think we learned something, and then what do? We think we know everything about it. Again, this is something that has always been with humanity. It's just has gotten more with the advent of the internet. We are surrounded by internet experts, right? You remember when the gorilla was killed a few years ago because of the child that got, that fell into the gorilla habitat, and they had to shoot the gorilla down in order to save the child. Goodness sakes, within an hour of that unfortunate situation happening, you had people online that all of a sudden, over the span of an hour, who have done, they're nothing in these industries involving animal handling, or working in zoos or anything like that. All of a sudden, tons of people were experts on zoo policies, habitat construction, tranquilizer use, and gorilla behavior. Everybody knew what was going on. Why? Because they did a 5-minute search online, found something they liked, and then they took it as gospel, and then they created it thinking, yes, I know something. That's a knowledge that leads up and a knowledge that puffs up. They might have gotten some sort of kernel of evidence, but it turned them proud and turned them into a person who knew everything. If we are people who know everything or think we know everything, we cannot learn. But also, again, Jeremiah chapter 17 is also another powerful verse. In Jeremiah 17, it's another one of those verses that just flies in the face of today. Because people say things, well, I know it in my heart that this is true. I follow my heart. Okay, listen to what Jeremiah says about the heart. In verse 9 it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. Okay, in other words, Jeremiah told us, you want to follow your heart? Know this. The heart is deceitful, it is sick, and no one can understand it. The Lord tests the heart. The Lord tests the mind. We need both. See, this is something we forget. We have people on earth who are all intellectual, and we also have people on earth who are all heart. The thing is, God gave us the intellect and gave us the heart. To have the intellect without the heart will make someone very cold. To have the heart without the intellect is to make someone overly emotional and hard on the sleeve and not think clearly. We need both. We need the heart to temper the intellect, and we need the intellect to guard the heart. We need both. But Screwtape, the devil, he would have us run on one or the other without caring, as long as we will stay away from the true calling of God. But then Screwtape gets into this situation talking about jargon, which jargon is just it's a fancy older word that means special words or expressions that are used by a particular profession or group and are difficult for others to understand. I don't know what you do in life if you're listening to this. I don't know what everybody's career is, but regardless of what career you have a jargon. You have specialized words that you use in your profession that you probably don't use in common conversation. I was a high school wrestler, right? And I could tell you about a match in which I would go out onto the mat and stand before my opponent. My opponent and I would shake hands, the referee would blow the whistle. Okay, so my opponent and I would go around in a neutral position, each trying to get a takedown. I would proceed to get a takedown by locking up with my opponent, pushing into him, waiting for him to push into me, and then I would execute a duck under. When I do a duck under, I then find myself behind my opponent, to which I do a front trip and take him down to the ground. I then look for a half Nelson, throw in a half Nelson, roll him over onto back and get the points. And to get my 3 near fall points and then lead to a pin. You may or may not have any idea of what I just said. But this is true of all of us. There are things in life, and there are areas in life that we have a specific jargon. We have two of our newer Christians in the church right now. They're both super into coffee. I have learned more about coffee from them than I ever have learned before in my life, because before I met them, I was like, okay, take coffee beans, ground it, add hot water, boom, you got coffee. Goodness sakes. You talk to these, you're talking about cold brews and nitros and having things at the right temperature and just all this stuff. It's jargon. It's a jargon I don't know. So again, that's what a jargon is. The devil wants to dazzle us with jargon. What do you mean? Well, consider this. It says, Screwtape says, your man has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, which is what they really are, but as academic or practical or outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste your time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous. That is the philosophy of the future. In other words, this goes back to your truth, my truth. The devil doesn't want us to think of our behavior as right or wrong, which all of our behaviors are. All of our behaviors fall into a right or a wrong situation. But if we think of our behaviors as right or wrong and we come to that truth, then what are we going to start trying to do? We're going to start trying to avoid the wrong behavior. But if the devil can tempt us into thinking that our behavior is academic, practical, outworn, contemporary, conventional, ruthless, strong, stark, or courageous instead of true or false, then we might hold on to an evil behavior because it is strong. It is my calling. It is my identity. It is my life choice. If I take sin onto myself as my identity, then I have less chance of walking away from it, because I will believe that sin is part of who I am. And if I view that sin as part of who I am, how can I leave it? I'll be destroying part of myself. So this is the dangerous nature of jargon. Again, go back to the original premise. The devil does not want us to, or does not want to awaken our sense of reason. Do we remember we have a right to evaluate our life and to seek to cut away those things which can do us harm? The book of Hebrews will teach us, throw off everything that hinders and run the race. But if I believe that everything that hinders me is actually good for me or a part of me or an integral part of my personality or life, I won't leave it. Something else to consider is out of the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 13 through 18. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Where it says this, it says, "Blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding. For the gain from her is better than gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are always of pleasantness, and all of her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed." This is what this section of Proverbs 3 is. It's the calling of wisdom and the blessings of those that find wisdom. Sometimes people get cranky because God's always referred to as a man, father, and all the male pronouns, and it's like, that's so not inclusive. But there are elements in the spiritual life which are called women: the church and wisdom. They're referred to as hers. And so, especially from the guy's point of view, a guy needs to pursue wisdom the same way a man would pursue someone to make them a wife. But if we do not pursue wisdom, then we will not be able to see our shortcomings. And we will not be able to see the diabolical uses of jargon, which the devil tries to use against us to try to get us to think that there is nothing wrong with the lives with which we're living. And if I do not think that there is nothing wrong with my life, then why would I ever seek after the Lord? After all, it's the Bible who tells us, no one is righteous, no, not one. All of us have some sort of sin that we need to get rid of. But if we believe the truth of the world, which tells us, you're fine, we won't go to the Lord. Seek wisdom and live. The devil will also try to get us to be distracted, and he'll try to distract us with a so-called real life. In chapter 1, Screwtape goes into this example from his experience as a tempter, to which he was talking to a man, he was hanging around a guy who was an atheist for 20 years, the story is. And the guy's sitting in the British Museum, and he's reading his books and reading his articles, and then he just has a thought come into his head about, is this all that we're going to leave behind after we die? Screwtape tells us that he thought that 20 years worth of work was about to go down the tube. And so this is what he says. He says, "I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch." He'll go on to say, "At least I think that must have been his line, for when I said quite, in fact much too important to tackle at the end of the morning, the patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past, and before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing just couldn't be true." The devil is going to try to get us to be distracted. There was a Christian writer back in the day named Corrie ten Boom, and she would say that the devil cannot make you evil, he'll make you busy. that is haunting. If the devil cannot make you evil, he'll make you busy. The point being that the evidence, as we talked about earlier, the evidence of God is everywhere. God is trying to get people to see him. The question is, how easily distracted are people to disregard God? And it doesn't take much. Again, I love this example from the first chapter of Screwtape, because how was Screwtape able to keep an atheist away from God after 20 years and almost losing him to God? Lunch. That was it. It was the use of lunch. It wasn't anything earth-shattering. It wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't complicated. It was lunch. It's like, no, man is not really that easily twisted. Oh, really? Are we not? You know how many times people jokingly have come to me over my years in ministry during the football season telling me, preacher, you need to hurry up because the game is on. And then they try to slap me on the shoulder and try to make believe that they're kidding. But in reality, him and I both know he's not joking. We are so easily distracted by pointless things which keep us away from God. But in our mind, we don't see it as distractions. To us, we got to get back to our real life. But for those of you out there who would prefer to have a biblical example, consider Luke chapter 10, verse 38 and following, which says this: Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teachings. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken from her. Mary and Martha. Mary's sitting at the feet of Jesus. Martha's trying to be the good hostess. Now, who's committing the wrong? I mean, there's things to do. Maybe you've been like this. We've had people in our house. If we have people in our house, we need to make sure the house is tidy. We need to make sure the meal's being prepared. We need to make sure everybody's having what they need. There are things to do. Mary, who lives with Martha and has the same house as Martha, is not helping with the situation with having guests in her home. And so she's sitting at the feet. Martha is upset because now she has to do everything by herself. So she goes and complains to Jesus. Does Mary not see? Martha is in the grips of this real life distraction. She is missing out on having Jesus in her home because she has to get food on the table or wherever the situation was. To which Jesus says, no. Mary has chosen right. It will not be taken from her. See, again, Martha's real life was household manners and etiquette. What's our real life distraction which the devil uses to get in the way between us and God? We all have them. And again, it doesn't have to be complicated. But do we know what they are? Oh, I got to get back to my job. I don't have time to read the Bible. I got to get back to work. I don't have time to spend time with my wife and family. I got the income to make. I don't have time to go to church. I got projects or games or practices or anything else that's going on. I got homework to do, so I can't take my kids to Bible class. Sunday is the only day that my family has off and we have together. So no, we're not going to go to church. We're going to go and spend time as a family. My church is the woods. We are surrounded by so-called real life. But in reality, most of the real life that we choose to surround ourselves with, if we're honest, we'll see it's distraction to keep us away from God. Again, the punchline in chapter 1 is that the devil will deceive us, blind us, and coddle us in order to keep us away from God. That's the whole point of it. Is that it's all about distraction, it's all about blinding, and it's all about keeping us comfortable so that our brain is numb. That's the thing. Our brain becomes numb to the realities around us. And so then if our brain is numb, we will not seek after God or Jesus Christ. I love how Screwtape finishes this first level. He says, "But the best of all is to let him read no signs, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the result of modern investigation. Do remember, you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone supposed it was our job to teach." See, I love that because the devil tempts us with the idea of if we can progress through our temptations to our sins, to what we think is so important to our lives, that it's going to take us to some sort of higher truth. It's going to give us meaning. No. The wages of sin is death. It's not the devil's purpose to teach us. It's the devil's purpose to kill us. It's the devil's purpose to damn us. It's the devil's purpose to keep us away from God. Sin is going to take us on the journey through shame, madness, then death. That's the path of it. And the devil's not interested in higher truth. The devil is just interested in keeping us away. So let's not deceive ourselves into thinking that the devil cares about us or wants to teach us or wants to show us some sort of truth. That's not the way it works. Consider what Isaiah wrote in Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, or his ear dull, that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he does not hear." This is the devil's plan, to get us to be so engulfed in our sin, so attached to our sin, that we separate ourselves from God to the point that God won't hear us anymore. That's what the devil wants. Don't let him fall. Don't let him get away with it, and don't allow ourselves to fall for it. Let us be the people who are willing to cling closer to God, to embrace the true real life, which is the spiritual warfare, walking with the Lord daily, working out our salvation with fear and trembling, and to kick the temptations to the side and seek after God. Grace and peace to you. I thank you for your time.